All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to week one. This week we'll be covering chapter one, which is mostly just kind of an overview of terrorism before we really start digging in deeper next week. You know, for many people, September 11th pretty much marks the beginning of terrorism for them. You know, and while 9/11 was no doubt, kind of a watershed moment in U.S. history for a variety of reasons, it really doesn't mark the beginning of terrorism. Terrorism has been around literally forever. It dates back thousands of years, to back even before the Roman Empire. So as we start this class, kind of the first thing I want you to do is to think about, what do you think a terrorist act is, or who is a terrorist? What kind of person would be a terrorist, or what kind of things would a terrorist do? How would you define those things? What are the characteristics of it? Okay, think about things like what was the target, what was the weapon, or what was the method used? Why did they choose that target? Uh, were there casualties? And then once you kind of have that in your mind, do you think that someone else would also agree with you on what you describe as a terrorist act is actually a terrorist act, or do you think they might have a different definition of what constitutes, a terrorist act or a terrorist? And then after that, think about would somebody from another country agree with you on that? These are questions that are kind of fundamental to the study of terrorism and the ability for people to devise strategies to combat terrorism. Have you ever heard the phrase, one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter? Well, that in a nutshell defines, terrorism. For some people, they view what happens as a terrorist act, right? And for this other group of people, they don't see those people as terrorists; they see them as freedom fighters. Um, so, what people define or recognize as terrorism is very much, in the eye of the beholder. So let's kind of get started with just some kind of basic definitions and concepts. The first one is extremism. And that's a word you hear thrown around all the time, especially here the last, few weeks, months. So extremism is radical opinions or the radical expression of one's political values. Okay, it's characterized by intolerance toward opposing interests or divergent opinions, and is generally considered to be a terrorist, a catalyst for terrorist behaviors. Generally speaking, extremism leads to terrorism, uh, but they don't constitute terrorism. Okay, extremist beliefs, no matter how extreme, at least in America, they're not illegal. They do not constitute terrorism in and of itself. Terrorism requires some kind of violent act in support of those beliefs. There's many people in this country that hold what would be considered to be extremist beliefs, and they're on all sides of the political spectrum. They're not just on the right; they're also on the left. Different religions, right? There's all kinds of different extremist beliefs, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. But very few people actually act on those beliefs, right? There are lots and lots and lots of people that have what would be considered extremist beliefs, but only a very small percentage of those people actually do something in the furtherance of those beliefs. So, how do you decide who those people are, right? Why do some people, two kind of the same people with kind of the similar beliefs, why does one of them choose to commit a terrorist act and the other one never does, right? These are the fundamental questions that you ask when you're looking at terrorism and trying to study terrorism and understand terrorism, right? What causes it, one person to do it and another person not to? And because it's difficult to do that, it's very hard to figure out who is actually going to act on those beliefs, versus somebody that maybe just reads a lot of extremist propaganda. Maybe somebody just goes to a march but is peaceful while they're there, or a protest. And then you have those that commit the violence. What is the difference there? Um, but regardless, extremism is radical opinions or radical expression of one's political values. All right, so then you get into the definition of terrorism. Now, let me back up just a second. So extremism Everyone kind of generally agrees on what extremism is. Now, what is exactly an extremist belief? Now, there's a lot of debate, for that now. But as far as the definition of extremism, there's not a whole lot of debate about what that is. Okay. Now, the definition of terrorism gets a little more complicated. All right. So even though it seems, really kind of easy to define terrorism, right? If I say, what's terrorism? You think you could tell me? There are many, many different definitions of terrorism, over 100 definitions of terrorism. The federal agencies, a lot of them have different definitions of terrorism. So even within our own government, right, the same federal agencies working for the same government don't have the same definition of terrorism. Then you have, scholars that have definitions of terrorism. You have other countries with definitions of terrorism. UN, we'll get into a lot more of this next week. The entire next week is dedicated to defining terrorism. So kind of in the meantime, there's some fairly generic, common characteristics of what we can use to help define terrorism. Okay, terrorism is politically motivated violence. Generally is directed at soft targets, which are like civilian targets. Generally, they're not directed at military targets or targets that are, hard to attack. But the main intention of terrorizing the audience, hence the name terrorism. Okay. Okay, so kind of what we describe as the modern era of terrorism, which is kind of since 9/11. Okay, it's primarily been characterized as a conflict between those who are waging a war on terrorism versus those that are waging a holy war in defense of their religion. If you look in the book shows a chart. It's got the number of terrorist incidents worldwide every year for almost the last 20 years. And if you look, there's quite a few every year, kind of around 10,000. So as I said, terrorism is nothing new. It's been around forever. And there's a lot of different types of terrorism. There's state-sponsored terrorism, there's dissident terrorism, several other kinds of varieties of political violence. We'll get into all those and what those mean kind of down the road. But regardless kind of the time period or the context, there's some commonalities that have been used to justify terrorism. So those that are committing terrorism, there's some kind of general commonalities that they use to justify their actions. Okay, perpetrators almost always claim they're championing some kind of noble cause or value. Okay, the perpetrators generally maintain that they're freedom fighters. Okay, they normally don't call themselves terrorists. Or if it's state sponsored, they're the champions of law and order. All right, and then religious terrorism is used to justify extreme violence. Okay, large numbers of casualties. So what causes it? What causes on terrorism? The book in this chapter just kind of briefly touches on it. I'm not going to spend much time on it because later on we're going to spend an entire chapter on the causes of terrorism. But there's many different reasons why people may commit acts of terrorism. And one of the interesting things about terrorism is it's an interesting topic to study because it's very interdisciplinary. Okay, criminal justice people like me study it, researchers study it, psychology studies it, political science studies it, sociology studies it, global studies studies it, right? There's a whole variety of people in different disciplines that all study terrorism, and they all kind of come at terrorism from different angles. So it's really interesting, a lot of like criminal justice issues, like criminal justice researchers study that. You might get a little bit of psychology, a little bit of sociology, but generally, like if you're studying police, right, that's usually criminal justice people that do that. But if you get into terrorism, you have people in all these other disciplines that's what they do, right? They study terrorism. All right, so one of the common features of terrorism, and really one of the central features of terrorism, is symbolism. Okay, symbolism is very important when you're talking about terrorism. Okay, the target that the terrorist group chooses holds some kind of symbolic value. There's a reason why they choose the target that they choose. Sometimes symbolism is even like the date, right, that they choose it. Why did they choose this particular date? Why did they choose this particular method, right? There's always some kind of symbolism, some kind of symbolic value that they attach to what they're doing, because they use symbolism to kind of create these linkages between their ideology, and their victims, right? The symbolism links these things together, and terrorists are really mindful of this um, because they use this symbolism as a way to kind of package themselves, kind of market themselves to try to gain support for their cause. So when you start trying to examine a terrorist act, it's a great place to start is what's the target? Okay, why did they pick this particular target? What is the symbolism? What were they trying to get across? Based on what they chose or when they chose to do it. For example, think about why did the terrorists attack the World Trade Center at 9/11? Why didn't they attack the White House? Why not the Empire State Building? Why not Yankee Stadium? Right? What was the symbolism of the World Trade Center? Right? Why did they choose that? All right, so a couple of terms here that you can use, when you're doing criminal justice stuff, but also, when you're examining terrorism. Mala prohibita and mala in se. Mala prohibita are acts that are made illegal because the statute says so, okay, or some sort of legislation has made it illegal. Mala in se are acts that are illegal because they're inherently immoral or wrong. Okay, so things like premeditated murder, rape, those are mala in se type of acts. They would never be made legal, right? Because they're inherently wrong. They're inherently immoral. But then you have things like gambling, prostitution, some drug offenses, things like that, that are mala prohibita. Okay, they're illegal only because legislation or something has made them illegal. So when you're thinking about terrorism, okay, so the question you have to ask then, are terrorist acts mala prohibita or are they mala in se? Are they fundamentally evil or immoral? Okay. Now, most people would pretty much say, well, it'd be something like premeditated murder, so it'd be mala in se. But you may be surprised, at the varying perspectives you can get on these questions, because remember, terrorism is in the eye of the beholder, right? So if you view yourself as a freedom fighter fighting against tyranny, would you consider that to be premeditated murder? Probably not, right? So these two kind of concepts, are really important when you start thinking about, what is terrorism and, how is it, excuse me, how is it viewed? Excuse me. Another term that you need to know is just war doctrine. Okay, just war doctrine is important when you're trying to examine terrorism. Okay, it's used to justify extreme violence or violence in general. Okay, it asks whether is it ethical to attack someone, what amount of force is ethically okay to use when you're defending yourself, um, and can someone justifiably use force to defend themselves? Okay, along these same lines, who can ethically be defined as an enemy? Okay, what kind of targets are acceptable to attack? Right? What's an ethical target? Well, depends how you look at it, right? So this doctrine has been used, to justify wars. One side believes their cause is just, and the other side that they're fighting against is unjust. And then you get into like jus in bello, which is the correct behavior when waging war, and jus ad bellum, which is having the correct conditions for waging war in the first place. So as you read the examples that they give in the book, think about those concepts and how they apply, to those examples. All right, so a little bit of history here. As I said earlier, terrorism is not new, been around forever. You go back to antiquity, there were things like tyrannicide. It was used frequently as the killing of tyrants, often championed, for the greater good. People that committed tyrannicide, even though Maybe they were put to death afterwards. They became legend, kind of thing. Maybe some statues put up about them. Um, and then on the other side, you had those in authority um, back in antiquity that would often exterminate entire populations of people. Right? They would conquer somebody and exterminate all of them, or they would force them into slavery. Um, they also would suppress, free expression of ideas or what they consider to be "quote unquote" dangerous ideas. Somebody like Socrates. You know, People talk all the time about this great philosopher Socrates. Well, he was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth. Okay, and he ended up committing suicide. So then you move into the Romans. The Romans used terrorism. They would use methods like crucifixion, to quell, dissident uprisings. And they would crucify people and they would line them on the roads coming into Rome. So everybody would know, hey, you mess up around here, you cause any trouble. This is what's going to happen to you. They would use brutal tactics. They would burn cities, force populations into slavery, or instead of maybe making you work, they would force you to fight. In gladiatorial games. Um, they used all these things to subjugate people, and then quell any thought, of any kind of rebelling. Uh, Conversely, regicide was also used, in Roman times. Regicide is the killing of kings. The most well known of these, was the assassination of Julius Caesar. All right, so then you get into the ancient and medieval Middle East. Terrorist tactics were common then, um, carried out by people called the Sicarii. They would attack Romans, members of the Jewish establishment they felt were working with the Romans. They used guerrilla tactics. They were part of this larger group known as the Zealots. I think you've all heard the term zealot before. Well, this is where it comes from. The common term today, zealot, is derived, from the name of these groups. Their preferred method of terror was assassination, and it was all done because they opposed the Roman occupation of Palestine. All right, moving on through history, come up to the French Revolution. Now we skipped, the Middle Ages. Um, Middle Ages was a really brutal time, and make sure you read, the little section they have there on the Middle Ages. But moving into the French Revolution, this starts to kind of bring us into kind of this more modern, kind of time of terrorism. Now, obviously it was the 1700s, so modern by 200 years. But this is where the term terrorism is actually coined. This is where the term terrorism actually comes from. It comes from the French Revolution. Edmund Burke is the one that coined this term. It's from the Reign of Terror, which is an example of state terrorism. Thousands of opponents of the Jacobin government were put to death after a trial at the Revolutionary Tribunal, usually by guillotine. Okay, and tens of thousands of people were killed during this time for opposing, the government. Moving into the 19th century, left-wing terrorism started coming kind of the forefront during the 19th century. You had anarchist and communist philosophers such as Karl Marx, beginning to advocate for the destruction of capitalist and imperialist society. So you had groups like the Luddites. There was a group from England, and they fought against industrialization because it threatened their jobs. They would destroy the machinery in new textile mills. They felt like the Industrial Revolution was going to destroy their way of life. Of course, the British government then responded with making laws that made the destruction of machines a crime, punishable by death. The other example the book gives is the People's Will in Russia, which is another example of left-wing terrorism in the 18th century. I'm not going to really go into them, but be sure you read about the group and are familiar with them. All right, moving on up into the modern era and the war on terrorism that I'm sure you all are fairly familiar with. It's characterized by what's known as the new terrorism. Okay, new terrorism is characterized by loose cell-based networks with minimal command and control, desire to acquire weapons of mass destruction, kind of these vague political, religious, mystical kind of motivations, asymmetrical methods to maximize casualties, and the use of internet and social media. So that is considered, the new terrorism is considered to be different from traditional terrorism, where you had these more clearly identifiable organizations. Um, they used more conventional weapons and explosives like handguns, things like that. They had very clear grievances. It championed, specific classes or groups of people, uh, and they didn't select their targets necessarily for maximum casualties. Right? They had what they call kind of a surgical selection of targets. Right? They would choose them for a reason, um, but the purpose was not to inflict as many casualties as possible. And we'll go into the reasons uh, why those things are the way they are kind of down the road. But this use of the internet and social media, right? This has created this new and kind of unprecedented opportunity for terrorist groups, to recruit, because they can now bring their cause or their war into the homes of millions of people. Uh, Targets are chosen to maximize coverage. Okay, think about the news now. You got 24-hour news cycle, um, and my gosh, how many different news agencies are there? Right? You have the traditional mainstream media, but you have all this other media out there, that is at their disposal to try to get people to cover them. So, prior to this 24-hour news cycle, on the internet, they would make an attack. It would happen. It'd be covered for a day or two. It'd be on the front page, and then it would work its way, further into the paper, and then, eventually be out of it, and it would just disappear. Right? Nobody would talk about it anymore. And if you didn't buy the paper, you may not even see it. Okay. But now it lives on in perpetuity on the internet. Like it's there forever. In my graduate class that I teach on terrorism, I make them go find, examples of terrorist acts, and you can find them. Some of them 10, 15, 20 years old. Like you can still find the news articles. Um, it's all still there on the internet. So that gives them kind of maximum coverage. Um, so effective use of that kind of stuff has really become kind of a hallmark of these new terrorist groups. Um, so obviously these new threats create, kind of this new challenge for policymakers, that are trying to address, some of these new more kind of modern terrorist issues or terrorism issues. All right, so at the end of the chapter, there's these three case studies, on three terrorists, um, kind of separated by um, how intricate their attacks were, what kind of level of technology they were using. Make sure you read those. Familiarize yourself with those three people. Um, but I'm going to stop here for this week. This video is long enough, I think. Uh, so be sure to read the material in the book. Don't think that this video uh, somehow substitutes reading the book. Make sure you read the material in the book. Look at the PowerPoint online. Complete the quiz and the assignment for this week. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.